across Nigeria. Welcome to Borderlines, the only show that takes you beyond borders. I can already see my guest is on screen. She's mighty ready. We're going to be having a wonderful conversation with her. The last time I saw her was on Al Jazeera. Yes, she was talking to Ken Roth, who has also been a guest on this show before. There are many contradictions going on in the world right now, like far too many. However, my guest today is going to help us unpack and make sense as best as she can within the time limit that we have. Her name is Varsha Gandikota-Nellutla. I'm going to ask in a minute if I pronounce that correctly. So it's Varsha, to the rest of you, Gandikota-Nellutla. She is the General Coordinator for Progressive International, a think tank working to unite, organize, and mobilize progressive forces around the world. She's also one of the founders and executive secretary of the Hague Group. You've all heard us mention that before. Yes, the Hague Group, a coalition of nations from the global south, which was formed in January 2025 to uphold the ruling of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court regarding Israel-Palestine, and stand together, that's the Hague Group, to defend the principles of justice, equality, and human rights. Varsha, welcome to Borderlines. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Indeed. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Ireti. Look at me. Bad manners, bad manners. Pleasure. No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you. Like I said, the last time I saw you, you were talking to Ken Roth on Al Jazeera, and it was really interesting. And I'm going to start with that because I think the first thing you unpacked there, at the very least, your first question was about human rights and the global south. And often when people talk about human rights, they talk about it in a massive umbrella form, not realizing that, yes, human rights to all, but in the global south, it means so much more and it's so multi-layered. I'd like you to talk about that because many people may not have watched it.
Sure. Thanks, Ireti, for having me. I think the question of human rights is very interesting because we all think we know what we're talking about, but often we have completely different definitions in our heads. So it's a strange exchange between individuals where about 15, 20 minutes in, you realize, oh, maybe we're not talking about the same thing after all, right? And I think there's a historical difference there where, and this is perhaps what you heard in my interview with Ken Roth as well, that human rights as a conception, there's one track of it that looks very much as civil and political rights. And there's, the historical root for that comes from some European revolutions and Latin American revolutions, both of the 18th and the 19th centuries, that really focused on rights such as freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, so on and so forth, that talked about these political rights. But for much of the rest of the world, and especially in Africa and Asia, as you very well know, we were still under full-blown colonization. And so even the conception of these rights came almost secondary, where we were asking, well, where's our right to food? Where's our right to develop? Where's our right to shelter and water and the right to our own land in the first place? Very much in this struggle of breaking the shackles of colonization. So I think those two strands are still very much in tension with each other because the fundamental fallacy of human rights is this assumption that nations meet as equals on the international stage. So we have these human rights that are universal, and each nation has an equal amount of bargaining power when it meets on the international stage to win or not win or these rights or develop them into conception. But of course, we know that that's not true because much of the system that we see today, whether it's a financial system with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank, or even the World Health Organization, these institutions that we've set up, or on the global trade system in terms of prices and tariffs and the way that we exchange goods and services are completely unequal, but unequal in a system that is dependent, right? Unequal in a system where global south countries are made, and as a result, people from these countries are made to be dependent on this system forever and more.
Indeed. Thank you for breaking that down. Like I said, it's going to be an interesting conversation. You all need to grab your pen and paper. You're going to learn a heck of a lot more. Yes, it's me and Varsha and the rest of you. So let's talk about the Hague Group. what does it mean? What, I was interviewed a couple of weeks ago on a TV station here, and I was asked, what would you like Nigeria? What more would you like Nigeria to do with regards to the genocide in Gaza and indeed the Israel-Palestine, the history itself? And I said, I'd like Nigeria to join the Hague group. I got a lot of people messaging me saying, what's the Hague group? So I'm going to let you talk about the Hague group. Break it down for us.
Thank you, Rito, and thank you for being an ambassador of the Hague Group without us knowing. I always say this, which is an odd way to open a definition of a Hague Group, but that it should not have been formed. Why do I say that? I say that because our existing legal institutions should have sufficed. Our existing multilateral institutions, whether it's the United Nations Security Council or the International Criminal Court or the Court of Justice, our World Trade Organization, all of these institutions of global governance should have been sufficient to stop Israel, if not 2 months in, if not 3 months in. Today, Ireti, we're meeting on the 23rd month of Israel's continued assault against the Palestinian people, and it still goes on completely unabated. So it's in the absence of a kind of real weakening of the multilateral system where countries have been kept at bay with vetoes, and in fact, even more with the threat of punishment and sanctions and tariffs, that we have had to form the Hague Group, which is a group of countries, governments of conscience that are saying something very simple. We need to defend international law, and we need to prevent and rescue international institutions from ruin. And the first way in which we are going to do that is cutting our own complicity with Israel's blatant violations of international law in the Gaza Strip and in the occupied Palestinian territories. So the Hague Group had a very modest ambition at its core. It was a group of 8 countries that came together: Colombia, Malaysia, South Africa, Senegal, Namibia, Honduras, Cuba, and Bolivia, that said 3 things. 1, we will respect our obligations of accountability, i.e., if there are war criminals flying over our airspace, entering our land, we will respect our obligation to arrest them and ensure all accountability processes are underway. 2, we will not export arms to be used against the Palestinian people by using our factories and our land and labor to produce these weapons of death. And 3, we will ensure that our ports, wherever they're applicable, are also not used as conduits for these arms and weapons and military fuel to go to Israel to be used against the Palestinian people. So that's the Hague Group, these 3 concrete commitments. It's not a talk shop. It's not about rhetoric, and it is not about making these symbolic statements in whichever fora, but simply saying, here are the policies, actions, and legislation that as governments we will enforce in line with existing international law obligations. Here's where I'll say the Hague Group is 8 member nations, but the international law obligations, as determined by the International Court of Justice, have been signed on by 124 countries in the UN General Assembly, but we don't see them enforcing it in their nations.
Indeed. And that's, all the countries you mentioned. Before I go there, let me ask you, why then should Nigeria join? Because Nigerians are listening in the diaspora at home. And indeed, some of our government people listen to this. Why should Nigeria join? Indeed, a message to our Minister of Foreign Affairs. Why should he ensure that Nigeria is signed on to the Hague Group?
The simple answer is because it's the law. That this is an obligation for Nigeria under international law as a member of the United Nations, as a member that is signed on and that is bound by the United Nations Charter, as a member of the Genocide Convention. But beyond that, I think there's something much more important, which is that it is actually for developing countries, for countries in the global south, that the rescue of international law is that much more important. We have always known throughout history that the powerful can do whatever they want. The bigger countries, the former colonizer countries, have far too much wealth that for international law to really restrain them. But it's the smaller countries, it's the global south developing countries for whom international law becomes the foundation on which we can actually wage our battles. So if we do not ensure that we rescue it, I think we'll see that it's going to come back to haunt us, if Palestine today, tomorrow certainly Nigeria, India after that, and so on and so forth.
And this is also what makes it so interesting. All the countries you've mentioned are part of the global south. But incidentally, they're often the countries that the international law is often quick to be weaponized against. They're often quick to be punished. But primarily, and I had a guest last week, I've forgotten his name now, very important guest. We're talking about Yemen and how every country has an obligation to prevent genocide. Here you are talking about the Hague Group, which is predominantly, countries of the global south. And of course, the likes of Yemen, who are saying, you're not going to continue with this. We're going to continue to defend. Where's the irony? I need you to unpack that irony for us. They tell us we're the ones that are bad, we're the ones that are savages, we're the ones that are uncivilized. They tell us we're the ones that need to grow, we're the ones that, we're the poor ones, etc. Yet we're the ones standing up against genocide.
Ireti, I have to tell you a story of the first time that I was ever inside the International Court of Justice, and this was South Africa's historic case at the Peace Palace, The Hague, when it brought its case, as you remember, now a year and a half ago, to The Hague against Israel under the Genocide Convention. And the courtroom is in a place called the Great Hall in the Peace Palace, and it's not actually great at all. It's quite small, but when you walk in, you have these beautiful tainted glass windows all around, all the panels, right? And I later learned that this was, of course, a $1 million donation by Andrew Carnegie, who, as you'll remember, of course, made his million from a different kind of a brutal, savage trade in the United States. But those panels were apparently supposed to describe what was called the ideal of progress, which is the fundamental motto and the kind of foundational stone of the setting up of the ICJ, which, if you read, talks about the idea of civilization and progress being brought from the Western world to those who, in those panels on those windows, still remain in primitivity, which is you and me, right? The rest of us who are waiting for enlightenment from the Western world. So we are under no illusions that a lot of these institutions that we're now trying to say, yes, we must rescue them, were actually never built for us at all in the first place. The ICC, as you know, in inner circles, would be, informally joked about as the black man's court, because you were so rare that it would ever bring someone from the Western world, and certainly not a white man from Western world, to on trial inside that court. So I think something incredibly powerful, right, about global South countries exerting this leadership in a city. The Hague Group bears the name of a city of the North, the so-called city of justice of the North, but you can't find a single global North country inside it actually standing up for international law. So I think there's something really radical and subversive about this moment, where we're demonstrating with a great amount of clarity exactly what we're setting out to do. And the moment is also something that calls for it. As you would have seen news of President Trump in the United States renaming the Department of Defense as the Department of War. And a lot of people are surprised by this news. But I think for many of us, we're going, we've always known.
We've always known. Thank you for telling the truth. Finally.
Yeah. So there's a bit of a mask off moment from all sides. So I think we're meeting the moment where it's at. And we certainly do hope and believe that this isn't just about Palestine, and this isn't just about acting in this particular moment, but really intervening for a radical reordering of the global world and the global order, institutional order, that has been biased against us from the beginning, from its conception.
Absolutely. It's a good segue to my next question. Impunity and the enabling of impunity, which is at the end of the day what this is all about, actually. So, since October, we've seen the United States provide Israel with something like 12 billion in additional military support. While Europe, I had a guest here who called, not my words, Ursula von der genocide, not my words, continues to arm export, and all of this, all the support that continues and continues and continues in spite of the ICJ orders, thanks to South Africa. Does this mean that the responsibility for the genocidal acts should actually extend beyond Israel, So to the likes of Europe and the UK. Oh gosh, the UK. Over to you. I mean, you can talk to UK. Gosh, yes, indeed. I see you're laughing.
There is certainly a legal case to be made for this, because the question of third-party state obligations isn't one that's to be taken lightly. I'm no lawyer, of course, but we know that there are efforts and evidence that has already been presented to this effect. One important case alongside South Africa's is one that was actually brought to the ICJ by Nicaragua and by Namibia. Both, the Namibian president talked about Germany's responsibility in the genocide conducted in Namibia and made an immediate and extremely tangible connection to its continued support now for Israel, and about learning from history in a different way, because Germany, of course, talks about learning from history, but it's not talking about learning from history when it's looking at the Nama Herero genocide. And Nicaragua brings exactly this case to the ICJ to talk about third-party state obligations. Because let's be very clear, let's be very honest here. All of these verdicts and instructions that ask Israel to stop doing what it's doing, none of us are holding our breath thinking maybe Israel's going to stop, but we certainly could be and should be holding our breath for our own governments, for our neighbor governments, to stop enabling this genocide. There are continuing cases now. You'll remember in the US, there was a case brought by what was called the Children of Gaza, if I'm not wrong, in the US against Blinken and Biden for being the two primary enablers of Israel's genocide against Gaza. The same was brought as a case in the UK courts against the UK government, who is currently enabling with surveillance, with exports, with materials, with technology, and of course with symbolic kind of handshakes and handshakes and also material and diplomatic support the genocide in Israel. And so, I'll bring it back to the Hague Group here. That's exactly what we want to sever. Because there's one question which is about kind of symbolic condemnations, vote for a ceasefire or veto against ceasefire, which also many countries aren't doing. But what are the material enablers that keep Israel's economy, the economic might underpinning that genocidal machine? Those are essentially our factories and our ports. If our factories did not produce those metals, and if our ports did not carry them over to Israel, this genocide would not be able to continue. So absolutely, I would say that responsibility extends well beyond just the government of Israel to many more who are abetting the current catastrophe.
But like you said earlier, the chances of them, well, let's not even talk about Israel, or before we even go to Israel, the chances of these people, the likes of Keir Starmer, Ursula von der Leyen, Macron, and etc., the likes of them actually being indicted is, and indeed, President Trump and President Biden, we mustn't forget President Biden, and by extension, Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, etc. The likelihood of them being indicted, or at the very least, their names being mentioned in this quote unquote hallowed halls, how likely is it? Or how slim is it, should I be saying? How slim is the question?
I think times are fast changing. We are seeing that unions, for example, are winning truly in being able to shut ports down with extremely hostile governments and being able to convince their governments to change their mind. And we've seen historical examples as well. Norwegian trade unions succeeded in getting their government to disinvest from the sovereign wealth with Israeli bonds. Right? And we've seen ports be shut down in Spain, a long movement run by social movements and trade unions who meticulously tracked down port after port after port, which vessel was coming to dock in Spain, until, of course, over time, with ending with President Sanchez's statement last week that there will absolutely be no transit of any kind of material, air or port otherwise, through Spain. These are, of course, not quick, dramatic victories as we might like, but these are slow victories that people's movements all over the world are winning. And as for a global majority consensus, I go back to what is the fundamental inspiration for the Hague Group and of course all of our work, which is looking at how we defeated apartheid South Africa. Then too, you'll remember, it didn't start off as a global movement, certainly extremely a high number of enablers for the apartheid South African regime, but it begins on the African continent with a very clear understanding that no country each of them engaged in their own anti-colonial struggles, right? Saying each of our movements is inextricably linked with the fall of the apartheid South African regime. And we have this broad consensus across the continent about supporting that struggle, which actually then moves to Europe, ending with, of course, the UN Security Council arms embargo, and where the Scandinavian countries are some of the first and then end up becoming the biggest supporters of this struggle against apartheid South Africa. And a decade later, it becoming a global movement culminating in Delhi, where I'm speaking to you from, in India, in the global conference against apartheid, where we start seeing trade sanctions across the board of tens of 20s and 30s countries issuing them in one fell swoop. So, of course, again, what I've just listed to you here didn't happen in a matter of a year or two. It happened well over a decade. But this sense of collective action is something that has to grow, because one thing that's really important is there are many governments that do want to act. And as you mentioned, smaller governments have lesser space to act for historical reasons, currently for both, even though it's a moment of change, it's also a moment of real danger. President Trump lashing out is certainly how shall we call it, a variable of unpredictability that keeps all the government on tiptoe, right? But you can only be afraid of individual punishment when you're acting alone. But if you're acting collectively, and when the Hague Group moves from being 9 to 19 and 19 to 90, it's extremely difficult for a handful of powerful nations, however powerful they may be, to punish these countries for acting in support of Palestine or in support of international law, because if they do so, they'll end up isolating themselves, not isolating us.
Yeah, but I've got to now ask you though, much as we've been brave, by we, I say the global South, we've seen what President Trump, how he responds to those who stand up against Israel. We've seen what he's done, or what they've done to Karim Khan, Francesca Albanese. Indeed, given the global South and, the desire to keep growing and the fact that we're still in that development space, how can we battle this giant that got this stick called the tariff, that he's ready to ruin our economy with?
Yeah, I don't think it's a question that has one answer, but I'm certainly if you may say so, a collective action propagandist. But I do think that that's the answer here too, right? Let's look at a different example, a completely different example, which was COVID-19. If you look at what happened with COVID-19, you'll remember that much of us, the developing world, simply did not have access to vaccines. It wasn't because the vaccine hadn't been discovered. 6, 8, 9, 12 months after the discovery of COVID-19 vaccines, much of them we could not get access to it. It's not because we didn't have factories that could produce them, but it is simply for the reason that pharmaceutical companies and global North governments that supported them did not want to release the patent, even temporarily. What is it that we tried so many different methods of trying to go to the WHO, trying to go to the WTO, try and get a temporary waiver on patents. None of it works until actually we have a group of countries, Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, Kerala government in India, Kisumu County in Kenya, so on and so forth, come together to say, surely global South must have more options than waiting, arms outstretched, begging for charity or waiting for pharma to find a conscience and release its own vaccines, right? So this bloc works together with Cuba that did have 2 vaccine candidates saying we'll share patent technology, Mexico and Argentina saying, yes, we will actually share some production technology, countries like Bolivia saying we will put in finance into this, which was a health internationalism bloc that took the market by themselves and produced for themselves. So that kind of self-sufficiency, of course, is not possible by any one country alone. But if the global South acts together, that's an immediate counter narrative and an immediate antidote to this kind of unilateral power established by countries like the US. And that applies, of course, on health and patents, but other areas of trade, other areas of energy sufficiency, of the green transition, because what we have to remember is all of global trade supply chains run through our countries. All of the global trade's final goods are made with our labor, are made in our factories. So we're actually not the weak players in this by any account. We produce what the world uses. We are just producing it in a system that's biased against us.
Indeed, and that's the system. I often say to people that right now, the global south, and by extension, really, I mean, Africa, is upsetting me. And why do I say that? Here we are, we have possibly the most transactional president, perhaps in the whole world, in the history of the human, human race, possibly. And, it would appear that I can't even say India wasn't dressed for success, but Africa has not been dressed for success. Africa has not shaped itself ready to take advantage of this collective growth that you talk about. Why is that? What is it that's preventing us? Why are we constantly missing the opportunity? Because indeed, arguably, there may never be any other opportunity like this. Will there?
We have to go through about 20 days of history lessons to get to the answer. But of course, our biggest problem, and this is true for multiple countries in the global south, but the African continent especially, is one of debt, right? Is no country is free from the crippling boot of debt that's on all of our necks. And if, as you remember, ideas like the new international economic order, the non-alignment movement were actually from the African continent. These were powerful ideas of collective action that were put forth by socialist leaders from the African continent, which were crushed. They didn't just die. I think when this history is often talked about, of the self-sufficiency, third world history, people talk about these as ideas that were fun, that we tried them, but, surely they didn't work. And of course, the capitalist system that we have right now is the natural conclusion towards which we've ended up. But it wasn't natural by any means. It was extremely unnatural that we were here, because there were these projects of collective action were deliberately killed and destroyed, and each country is made to stop acting together. Debt is a very good example of one where fiscal space across all of these countries would be freed up if you could have, say, a debt default together, where we say collectively as global south countries, we actually don't owe you this money. Forget reparations.
Yeah.
This wouldn't even be a percentage on reparations, which is the next level, but just so we're going to stop paying. But we're so far away from that moment. Think about Haiti paying reverse reparations, right? To colonizer France for years to come afterward. Look at a country like Zimbabwe right now, which is still under sanctions because it tried to do land reform and immediately is hit by sanctions by the European Union and by the United States. And now, I don't know if you've seen this in the news, they are being asked to pay compensation to their former white colonizer families for land that they took back, $3.5 billion, which you may ask, what the hell is Zimbabwe getting $3.5 billion? It doesn't have that. It doesn't. It's going to the African Development Bank to get a loan to pay off compensation to its former colonizers, only to get rid of the sanctions that the US and the EU have put on its boot. With the UK, its actual real former colonizer taking zero responsibility for paying any reparations at all. And I'm not making this up as a radical thing. In fact, there is an agreement where the United Kingdom, post-Rhodesia becoming Zimbabwe after the independence movement, actually says on paper, we will take on the responsibility of paying for this land that you're appropriating and giving back to the native Black Africans. And then after successive British governments come into power, a Labour government, in fact, the Secretary of State, Claire Short, simply says, the crimes of colonization are of eras past. The current Labour government has no connection to British colonial history whatsoever, and simply shirks the responsibility of an actual agreement called the Lancaster Agreement that was drawn up between the former British colonial government and the Zimbabwean struggle, or the Rhodesian independence struggle. So these are all, rooted in history, where there have been deliberate attempts not just to stop us from freeing ourselves, but a continuing process of what we can see is a colonial dynamic, whatever name you want to give it.
Then we have BRICS. Right? We have BRICS, which is not bricking very well, if I may say. But given what you've said, and it kind of triggers something off in my head. Right now, we're seeing an incredible, an amazing, a really kind of effective uprising in Nepal, right? So it will appear that citizens are ready to say enough, no more. We're not going to negotiate with your corruption. You're not going to continue to steal our democracy from us. We are going to demand for better, or we're going to kick you out. Now, if I then sort of place that on top of the countries, the global south countries, why then don't they come together like Zimbabwe? Reach out to global and say, come together with us. We are all in the same boat. Let's literally stand up and rebel and say, we're not paying. Do your worst, because how many countries in the global south can you invade, right? So it's a case of do your worst, come after us, but nope, I'm not paying because I don't owe you any money. In fact, you owe me any money. Why doesn't the African Development Bank say to them, you shouldn't be paying this money? So there's all these sort of why don't, but the people, I always say the citizens of the global south are ready to say, we're just not negotiating. So what's the problem with the leaders? Because really the problem, it's the leaders. Why are they so impotent?
I think I certainly wouldn't want to speak for the African continent, which I don't know very well, but certainly there are two problems. One is that we do see a nexus and between some of our own elites and the Western elites, right? Or let's say winners of the capitalist imperialist project. And that nexus does exist. It exists in India, which is very much where some of has the highest levels of inequality, in a country where, nearly 20% of our population goes to bed hungry. We have some of the largest number of billionaires in the world, right? Billionaires in terms of dollar rates, not in terms of rupee rates. And that's incredible that we could have a system like that. And we know that this is true everywhere, where there are winners in each of our countries who also happen to be the ones who are in government, or at least have the government in their pockets, in a kind of unholy nexus between corporates and our so-called democratically elected leaders, which is a problem, something that must be dismantled. But then how do we dismantle it? When we look at people rising up, you look at spontaneity and you think, oh, look at this, there's spontaneously people rising up, spontaneously people kind of breaking down governments. But there's nothing spontaneous about victories. If you look at the Indian farmers' victory, where we successfully, after 2 years, the Indian farmers managed to defeat 3 farm bills, becoming once again, which were meant to be privatized and led agribusinesses, privatize agriculture and let agribusinesses into the country. And this is no accident, right? It's because we've had strong farmer unions that have been protected, because you have had social movements that have been protected. So this question of organizing is not one to take lightly at all. It's not spontaneity that brings people onto the street. It's organization that brings people onto the street. It's mobilization that brings people onto the street, which, again, there has been a systematic project of dismantling these things like trade unions, through political repression, or sometimes, in fact, through the other route, which is pumping money into these projects and turning them into NGOs. So they lose the political radical edge and in fact become more about service delivery that is is very not so uncomfortable for people, where they're not engaging with harder political questions. But the second I want to say, when you talk about impotency of leaders, is courage is something that's contagious. And I think leaders and governments all both learn from each other, but also learn from their own track record. And every single time that a global south country tries to free itself, tries to gain a bit more sovereignty, a bit more fiscal space for something, you see that the punishment comes down extremely swiftly. The Zimbabwe example is extremely illustrative. You have a government that's not socialist by any means, that's not, incredibly just a radical, but has a very simple proposition. We've been colonized for so long, and for 80% of our land, our arable land, has been taken away by a handful of 4,000 white colonizer families. We're going to take that back and give it back to our own people. And for that, they're immediately punished with brutal sanctions for the next 40 years. Now, what do you think a government like that is going to do? Is it going to dare to take up a radical distributive project once more. You see South Africa stand up for Palestine at the ICJ and immediately hit with, sanctions against some of its people, threats of tariffs, and of course now what's happened with the fallout with the United States. You see a country like Honduras that says we're not going to let for crypto billionaires who have from the US come in, bought up a whole island and said we're going to build a libertarian paradise for ourselves. So through their own laws, through their own constitution, with a unanimous vote in the parliament, the Honduran president says we will not have special economic zones that give away land like this to rich billionaires. Our land is our own. And immediately they're hit with a case of $10.4 billion, which for a small country like Honduras is, nearly 2/3 of its GDP. And so what are we seeing from this? It's not that governments aren't acting. It's not that there isn't any appetite amongst global South leaders, but every time we do try to take our own trade back, our own economy back, our own land back, boom, the punishments come down and they look different from ERA's past. They don't look like colonial armies swooping in and taking over your town hall. They look like sanctions. They look like tariffs. They look like this hybrid warfare methods, which still manage to do what they want, which is clamp down any efforts at seizing sovereignty and keep you embedded in this cycle of dependence.
Indeed. You can call. We don't have much. It goes so fast, and I want to keep Varsha here forever, but I can't. I'm not allowed. And she's got to do more things. Right. You can call 0201-277-0993. The female line is 0201-465-7190. Send your questions, your comments to 0809. And you've already started calling. 597-5805. I promise you, Varsha, my listeners are my co-hosts. They have a habit of trying to take over. I didn't get your call on time. You can call back. Okay, so whilst they're sorting themselves out. Oh, okay, here we are. Right, very short, sharp, and succinct, please. Thank you. Hello. Hello.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Marvelous.
Okay, go ahead, Marvelous. What's your question? Oh, the line cut off. Sorry. Right. So here's the thing. I'm glad you mentioned Honduras because most people don't know about this island and, the fact that you've got what we call the tech bros and indeed how dangerous that sort of, that cabal of people are to the world. And yes, we want AI. We all want progression. We all want technology. But what are we willing to pay for it? Is it our liberty? Is it our freedom? Is it our privacy? The cost of it, how expensive it is to the world. And really, the world where we should all be free to do and grow, and a world of equality. How dangerous is it?
I think it's extremely dangerous. It's a kind of dystopia, right? If you look at some of the founding documents, almost a constitution of sorts for this libertarian paradise that the tech billionaires wanted to build, which, by the way, they're not doing in any of their own countries because they know that it won't happen. They're only coming to ours to buy our plan with these, buckets of cash that they think will make governments fold. And when that doesn't work, of course, the stick. When the carrot doesn't work, of lawsuits and bilateral investment treaties being at risk. If you look at the constitution of the libertarian paradise, you see things around things like any of the residents being completely free from control of the Honduran law and constitution and being subject to their own private law. You see details around their own private protective police force, not the Honduran police force, not the Honduran army. You see voting rights and a democratic system that is completely different from any administration of a province in Honduras, where here, in fact, in one of the clauses, it says voting rights could be made as an idea proportional to the amount of property a person owns or a resident owns on that island. And there were invitations for medical researchers, for these innovative startups to come and do experiments on extending longevity, creating these drugs and practices, medical practices that could make people live forever, I suppose, immortality labs, as they call them. Once again, rules free, exactly the kind of wouldn't fly, say, with the FDA in the United States, but they think they can get away with it on a tiny remote island that they buy up in Honduras. So that dystopia, really knows no end. The point is, you have a group of rich people that simply want to be bound by no rules and instead want to use our land and our labor to build this kind of dystopian paradise for themselves. Nigeria is certainly at risk because we know that you have Itana, right? The new digital special economic zone that's just come up, which comes from the exact same brand and breed of essentially billionaires trying to look for their next playground. And it would be incredibly sad for our revolutionary independent struggles before we even complete a century of freedom for us to give that up, if not to Western empires, now to corporate billionaires, tech billionaires from Silicon.
Indeed. Right, I'm coming to your call now. Hello. Hello.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm very well. Titilokwe, I need you to speak up louder, please.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No, you're still not loud enough. Louder, please. We can't hear you.
I agree, our guest, and tell her.
Titilokwe, can you hear me? I can't hear you.
Hello?
Can you speak louder or turn up the volume of your phone?
I'm speaking. I'm shouting. Can you hear me now?
Okay, better. Sorry.
Okay. You sound much like the Malala Yusuf side, the Pakistani activist. Number one, she has raised a lot of issues, but I think I want to disagree a bit with her about the wrongs of the colonial masters. Yes, they did a whole lot of wrongs, but the truth is that India, for instance, even China, and some countries have even moved much more than Britain or UK themselves. For instance, when John Major was living in the late 90s, the UK economy was bigger than China and India combined. But today, India economy alone is bigger than UK economy, not to even talk of China. They have done so much well for themselves.
So what do you want to say? Titilokwe, you need to hurry up, please.
What I want to say is that even the Indians, the Chinese, they are not different from the colonial masters themselves.
In what way?
For instance, now, just two days ago in South Africa, 7 Chinese men were jailed for human trafficking and bad the treatment of their labor, slavery, for 20 years each. So the Indians to do the same thing in Nigeria or even in other African countries. They expect people take advantage of them, collaborate with local politicians.
But there's one difference. But okay, I'll let Varsha answer that. I was gonna answer it for you. Quickly.
The second part is this. I want to take her to the Shanghai Cooperation. China and India has just restored diplomatic ties after about years of rifts now. What does it say about the kind of competition between the people who ordinarily should have come together to face the West?
No, what do you mean? Sorry. Oh, Titilokwe, are you there?
What I said is that instead of China, India, Pakistan, all of them coming together, most times they fight one another. Meanwhile, they are bringing down their own strength.
But we saw them together, that's part of the Shanghai meeting that you mentioned.
I have what's our own opinion on the Shanghai Cooperation.
Okay, thank you.
And what is likely to happen in the future.
Okay, thank you.
The challenge of Shanghai and the challenge of BRICS is that some members...
Titilokwe, I've got to cut you off. The time's gone. You've used up 5 of my minutes.
Okay,
Bye.
Okay.
Right. Oh, that's Titilokwe. Gosh, I'm running out of time. So the question, I think his first question is that the likes of India and China, given their, the fact that they have a large economy, etc., they are beginning to behave, when they come to countries in Africa, they're beginning to behave like colonialists. That's the first question. He wants your opinion on that. The second one is, what do you make of the Shanghai group, the one we saw the other day?
Sure. I think I heard him begin to say, I disagree with I disagree with this framing. I don't think we disagree, actually. There are no illusions. And in fact, I felt like we were just lamenting that, right? That we wish we had better governments and that we had better leaders who could actually take on this. It's certainly the case that India and the Indian government wants to be a hegemon in its own region. For example, we're surrounded by other smaller countries, whether it's Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, Nepal, and with both our economic might as well as our geopolitical might, because of this rivalry between and China, one must remember that India has been backed. And of course, that's fracturing a bit now with Trump turning against us because of Russia. But for all of these years, India and a Modi government, which has been absolutely cruel to its own citizens, being incredibly Islamophobic against 200 million of its own Muslims in its own country, has been, however, not condemned. We were talking about human rights. India's record of human rights is not something that is actually brought up by any of the Western leaders on the international stage, because they want India and Modi to stay in power to keep China at bay, right? So certainly there are no illusions around kind of the weight that countries play. But an interesting thing to note about China's relationship, I think, with debt, the question of debt trap, right, which is often thrown around a lot about how China's doing this terrible debt diplomacy in Africa. But facts and the evidence, beg to disagree, which is, if you look at any of the loans that African countries have received from China, there are no conditionalities. The only condition that exists is that the loan be paid back, but there are no conditions on how it might be spent, unlike the IMF, unlike the World Bank, which come with specific conditionalities. That is the structural adjustment, as we know, that has destroyed African countries from asking them to pull away money from social sectors like education, like health, like public infrastructure, and instead put it in essentially neoliberal models, privatize, liberalize, globalize, and open it up for foreign direct investment, which has made us more and more unsovereign over the decades in the recent times. But across, I think this is a Johns Hopkins study, which studies a decade of loans given out by China and finds that not a single one on the continent actually has any of these conditionalities attached, which I don't think is a small matter at all. In fact, that's what's most radical about something like the BRICS as well. You asked about BRICS earlier. Something that's most radical about BRICS, the BRICS Bank, that we might even have an alternate option, an alternate lender from which the global south can take money, is incredible. Without conditions, is an incredible opportunity. China plays that same role, but without these two, you would be left only and only with one option, which is to accept the conditions of structural adjustment and privatization from the International Monetary Fund, which has been the only lender. We call it the lender of last resort. Really, it's the only lender that global south governments have had throughout our independent histories.
Indeed. Thank you. Right. You can call 0201-277, 0993, 0201-465-7190, or send your WhatsApp to 0809-597-5805. Otherwise, I can use up the last couple of minutes. So Varsha, here's a question. It's often said, and you could say to me, Ireti, who knows? I don't know. It's often said that brutal empires become even more brutal in the last moments, as, why are you people calling now? You can call back if you can make your questions very quick. That they become even more brutal as they get closer to the end. Are we watching the end of an Israel with impunity and Zionism, right? Or are we watching the beginning of a free, the road to a free Palestine? Hold that thought. Let me answer this call. Otherwise, they shall complain, and then you'll get a chance to answer. Hello.
Good evening.
Good evening. 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm Yusuf. Can those our leaders, the leaders in the global south, can they summon the courage to defy the social order by not paying the debt inflicted on them and say, hey, come, you are happy?
I've asked her that question. She's already answered that question.
Oh, I was not privy to.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, I'll see if she's able to answer it again, yes?
All right. Except those who have revolutionary tendencies.
Okay, thank you. Well, it was the question about can our leaders in the global south stand up and say to the debts that's on their neck. So I'm going to let you, we've only got 2 minutes or so. 1 minute. No, less over what? Just over a minute. They're screaming at me. Just over a minute. Yeah, go ahead. My first question first, and then, yeah.
The answer, both, luckily for us, and my last 40 seconds is the same. History and our future, I don't think, is predetermined. It is for us to shape and for us to make. there is certainly no conclusion that this is Israel's last gasp. It is in the nature of the project of Israel that it will keep going to war. As we've seen, it has struck 6 countries in just the last year with the support of the United States, and it will keep doing so because it is the way for it to remain in control in the region. But certainly beyond that, is this a road to free Palestine? I certainly hope so, and that's why we're all engaged in these projects, where we are slowly but surely chipping away at this block of the empire through all of its proxies and bringing our liberation movements to the core of it. So I certainly hope that will be the case, and that we will build not just the road to free Palestine, but to a liberated global South and to socialist governments in each of our own countries and have leaders of.
Thank you so much, Varsha Gandikota-Nellutla. Thank you. God bless you. We need you back. We have more questions.
Thank you so much for having me, Ireti.
Do please come back. Say yes.
Of course, whenever.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a fabulous weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
More conversation, more talk, more right after this.
99.3 Nigeria Info. We are more than just radio. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nigeria Info FM. Check us out on Facebook at Nigeria Info 99.3. Follow us on Twitter at Nigeria Info FM and on Instagram at Nigeria Info FM Lagos for live updates as it happens. 99.3 Nigeria Info. Let's talk.